Hello and welcome to part 3 of episode 300. Yes, you heard right, part 3. If you are a new listener to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, well, you might want to check out parts 1 and 2 first, as they focus more generally on the world of remote work and the changes we've seen in the last 3 years, the changes we might see in the next 3 years, and how it has affected us as professionals. But of course, you're very welcome to stick around for this part, where I ask guests what they'd like to hear in a show such as this one in the future. And I also gave them the space to share anything that was on their minds with you, the listener. If you're a hardcore regular listener of the show, then you might remember that in the other 2 parts, I mentioned that I'd be releasing the full interviews from our guests as another podcast. And I can happily say that that is out now. The show is called Work-Life Changes and Remote Work in Organizations. Yes, I know, a long title, but I didn't want to mention remote work without mentioning the organizational piece, and I think the changes part is quite important. So anyway, gradually it will start appearing on all podcast apps. It's already out in the main ones. And the first episode is out with Mark Kilby, and it has a great unpublished segment about new tech in asynchronous communication. So check it out. Before moving on to our guests' contributions, I wanted to have a quick recap of the type of things we've covered in the last 100 episodes. First off, if you're a regular listener, you might have noticed the change in format during the 3 years. In 2019, for example, I was playing with interviewing a few people and then bringing them all together in one episode, using one bit of their conversation for one episode, then another bit for another one. And I was quite pleased with how some of them turned out. For example, episode 209 was all about the journey of the remote leader, and it's going to still be so relevant. And it had Marcus Vermuth, who's been on a lot of the episodes, Laila von Ivensleben, then Tim Burgess and Millie Blackwell. It's a great episode, but it took a very long time to produce. And it also meant that you, the listener, did not get to hear the whole conversations, which were very enjoyable as a full conversation just with one person. So in the end, it seems like the format where we sit better is having 2 episodes a month, 1 guest interview, and then I do one with co-host Maya Middlemiss. And I'm really enjoying these co-hosted episodes that we call, for the most part, What's Going On. We try to bring some day-to-day stuff in. We talk sometimes about tools or about little things. We talk about concepts of remote work as well, even though they're quite from now, the very timely episodes, because we look at articles. We try to draw things that are a bit more evergreen. So hopefully, if you're listening through the back catalogue, if you come across some of these, well, hopefully they're still interesting, even if they've moved on. Well, if life has moved on. We try to bring articles and things to comment on that are about changes in legislation, trends. We basically pick some of the stuff we've come across over the last month and share it with you. And if you like reading, if you want more recommendations, you can sign up to our newsletter over at virtualnotdistant.com. And we started the What's Going On episodes during the pandemic because there was just so much stuff going on. And some people really liked them because it kept them up to date without having to consume lots of information themselves. But if you're a regular listener, you might have noticed that there was a point at which we stopped, because all we were hearing was hybrid, days in office, hybrid, go back to office, hybrid. And it was getting very samey without contributing anything new to the conversation. And at one point, we even released an episode called Remote is Not the Only Current Challenge, because the conversations we were hearing were about the fact that remote work, well, that the world of work, at least, well, even of the non-knowledge workers, was all falling apart because of the way that remote was being done. And, well, there was a lot of other stuff going on, wasn't there? And so that episode is from the 18th of February, 2021. But now things are moving on a bit, and also we're trying to restrict our commentary to 1 or 2 articles in those episodes because we really can't talk. And Tim Burgess, who you've heard in these episodes of episode 300, he covered a What's Going On episode as co-host, bringing the view from Australia as well. So I like that. I like to, well, I love co-hosting. A lot of the shows I do have co-hosts in them. I'm thinking of writing a book. Well, I'm going to write a book on co-hosting, but I don't know when I'll start. Actually, even the planning of it. There's other stuff coming up. I've also tried to bring in guests to talk about things that you might gain some inspiration from and even advice. And also try to make those topics diverse. But at the same time, I'm trying to schedule it so we're not jumping around too much, which sometimes is difficult. So we've had a lot of conversations on asynchronous communication, even asynchronous facilitation. And by facilitation, we mean working with a group to bring them to an objective. And that episode was with Simon Wilson, who you've been hearing from in these episodes. And so we talked about asynchronous facilitation, and that has now developed into a self-paced course on asynchronous communication for managers who want to introduce that kind of interactions in their teams. So watch this space. We're still working on it, but let me know if you're interested to know more about it. And regarding async, I finally got to bring on Tammy Bjelland from Workplaceless, who I'd been planning to talk to for ages. But the problem with only having 1 guest episode a month is that I'm so limited. But I did also finally get to bring on Chase Warrington from Doist, who I'd met a few years ago, and also Laurel Farr, who she has been very present in the show over the last 100 episodes in different bits and pieces. But I just wanted to put some time to speak to her for a little bit longer because I get a lot from talking to her. So at the same time as trying to bring things that might seem more relevant to everyone, I've covered broader topics and wider conversations to try to capture how remote work is affecting different segments of society. So I've already talked about the episode on remote work for social change, but we also had the view from South Europe, Ireland, Belgium, and Guatemala. And Carlos and Elsa more recently talked about their initiative of Pueblos Remotos, which is where they bring local entrepreneurs into contact with remote workers. And they came and told us about how that was going. And also we covered, there was so much. We covered so much. We covered some surveys that were happening as they were happening. And those were episode 254 to 256. We looked at Ireland, then also what was happening with people's perception of how leadership was shaping the workplace and also attitudes towards hybrid. And this was an ironic one Maya and I covered in episode 215 on 19th of December 2019. So before the pandemic had properly hit, certainly before any lockdowns were happening in the Western world. The title of that was Remote Has Taken Off, Now What? And that episode, it had a short contribution also from Rowena Hennigan. But the whole episode was basically about, okay, everyone's talking about remote now. Things are really finally taking off. What's going to happen now? And of course, we could have saved that episode, talked about asynchronous communication instead. Anyway, I love podcasting. But the experiment that I was most thankful for was the Connection and Disconnection in Remote Team series. So how that came about, in one episode, I threw out the suggestion to you, the listeners, of saying, if any of you want to collaborate with us in any shape or form and in a way that will help us to release more episodes, let us know, because our resources only go so far. And Tim Burgess, who is also a regular listener and who had also been involved already with the show, he suggested that Shield Geo, the company that he co-founded, could come on board as a partner for a bit. And to cut a long story short, one of his team members, Bree, took over for 7 episodes and produced a whole series on loneliness and remote teams called Connection and Disconnection. We had to produce new artwork even, so thank you very much, friend Kate Rance, who moved to New York from the UK, but she still helps us. Yeah, she had to produce new artwork because some of the episodes had 7 voices in them and we'd never had 7 people guest on a show. So we redid the episode artwork. And of course, Bree was taking over the hosting, so she needed to appear in the artwork as well. Talking about Bree, we're finally getting to the guests, listeners. Let's hear from her talking about her experience of that season and how she lays down really well something that has been on my mind for a while.
Yeah, so I think most of the interviews that we did were pre-pandemic. There were a lot of advocates. There were a lot of people that, had been talking about remote work for quite some time and really believed in it as a movement, really believed in it as something that we were going to all experience in the future. But obviously no one had any idea where we would be. And so it was very interesting, the last few interviews I did when, the pandemic had begun, it had started, to sort of hear the difference in how they were speaking about remote work. And it was almost like this, a totally different way of relating to it, a totally different way of, it wasn't this, thing that potentially we'll experience all together in the future. It was this thing of, we all know about this now. We're all in this together. We're all experiencing the sort of safety and chaos at the same time of what remote work can offer. And so that was very interesting to, I guess, compare those two. And I'd be interested to speak to them again now, years later, to hear how they're feeling about it now, because, at the onset of the pandemic, things were very different. Everyone just wanted to talk about, what was happening around the world and those sorts of things. But we sort of had to go back over the last year, I think, to the basics almost. And a lot of people, because they were experiencing this for the first time pre-pandemic, advocates was sort of talking about all of these nuances. We were kind of doing all of these think pieces of what it could mean, what could the future look like. But now we're kind of experiencing it together, and we're back to basics. We're back to, we need a policy in place. We're back to, what could it mean to hire across, multiple countries? What could it mean to hire employees in a different time zone? What does asynchronous versus synchronous meetings look like? We're really at the basics of how to make this work at the moment, which I think is sort of interesting, because we're all in this, I guess, beta test together almost. It's like, is this going to work ultimately? And I think we've ultimately come to the decision that yes, it is going to work. And these conversations aren't in theory anymore, where we all have something to reflect back on or use as an example.
You've articulated what I've been feeling with this going back, because I've been feeling this. I mean, I've had a real big tension, and it started with the Connection and Disconnection series where, because I remember you say, someone, they really want to talk about what's happening now. And I was thinking, no, because also I thought it would last for 2 months, right? The whole thing.
Yes. At the time we all did. Yeah.
Yeah. But in a way, and also hearing what you were talking about, how different the challenges were and the way of meeting those challenges. For example, when there was no lockdown, you could go out of the house, whereas where there was lockdown, it had to be something you dealt with in the home. So I think that the way of solving some of these issues is so different if you can get out of the house versus not, that I think it was the right decision to not let the pandemic infiltrate the series, because it makes it more evergreen, hoping that we don't get more lockdowns, because you never know. But anyway, that's a separate thing. But what you've said about, I've been feeling this tension in the show itself between, serving the people who've been around, if not since 2014, since a bit later, and the people like you who want these nuanced conversations, who want to go deep, who are ready to start talking about things like socioeconomic impact of remote work, versus the people who have joined us during the pandemic, where, of course, downloads went up because people were looking for information of the basics. And I really felt that tension in the show between serving both audiences, and you've just articulated it. It's that the conversation had to go back to basics because of what was going on in the context. But we were stuck going, we were talking about other stuff and we want to continue.
Yeah, for sure. But, I think on the flip side, I'm really excited that because we have, these larger players now, we have these big companies that are joining in on this. We have, huge industries that are sort of joining into remote work that are committing to keeping this alive within their communities, within their companies and organizations. I think maybe we potentially have the manpower to actually implement this change and these kinds of, I guess, the theories that we were talking about pre-pandemic, that they can kind of shift from that think piece stage into potentially actually having an impact now. So I guess there's hope. There's hope with that as well. But yeah, there definitely is a tension, isn't there? It is basics, but also maybe it will be better in the long run.
So I'm hoping to continue addressing the different audiences that the show has picked up over the last 3 years, as I was commenting with Bree. So let's hear from the guests what they would like us to talk about. Some guests had general thoughts and others had some more specific ones. So let's start with the general. Let's bring in Tim Burgess first. He's been leading a distributed company for a few years and talked on the show about his experience. And as I said, he took over as co-host, bringing the perspective from Australia. Then we'll hear from Theresa Sigillito Hollema, who as a guest has talked about leading global teams, which is her speciality, and with whom I've had many conversations about leadership, cultural diversity, and introducing hybrid. And I was also her guest when she hosted a show for an episode for the Center for Advancement of Virtual Organizations. And we reposted that on this podcast. It's the only time we've done so. So thank you, Theresa, and thanks, Kavo, who hosted the show. So let's start with Tim.
I hope if it's still rewarding for you that you keep going to 500 episodes and 1,000 episodes.
Oh my God, I can commit to 400.
I just wanted to throw a big number out there to freak you out.
Okay.
I mean, for me personally, what I found really interesting is learning about companies and people, organizations in whatever form they come, where they're doing things that are a little different to the let's say the mainstream, but that it's working well for them. And for a long time, the remote community was that, right? We were on the fringe. We were doing something that was very different to what everybody else was doing, but it was working really well. And that was a really fun place to be, to think like, oh, there's this secret that I don't know why more people don't get it, but it's fantastic once you know what it is. And I think there are lots of those secrets out there.
Pilar, so I came to eventually you, but definitely to your podcast when I was trying to figure out what virtual work meant and what remote work meant. So many, many years ago. And I came to your podcast and stayed there because you cover so many different angles on this topic. And you're able, because of your characteristics, to connect them together. So when you ask me what is for the future, what needs to be included, I'm almost lost to think about what, because you already look at it as so many angles, which is what I admire. And then I would answer, well, maybe from more of a psychological point of view, but you're already doing that on another podcast with your friend and your colleagues. So you cover all the angles for me. I just continue to think that the angle that I like is really what happens to us when we are working with technology, when we're working from a distance, when we're working with trying to collaborate with colleagues who are sitting in other countries. What happens to us psychologically, neurobiology, all those levels as well. That's just my own personal interest. So can keep doing what you're doing, because I think you're opening up the conversations with a variety of different angles and different people that makes it very interesting.
Thank you, because that is such great feedback, in that I'm glad that you like the diversity, because that's what keeps me going as well. And I am a bit sad that I decided to narrow it down, but you can't cover everything. And also this whole thing about the psychology and the more, maybe even I would think the more personal experience of living in a world where you have most of your work connections online and stuff. There's something there.
For sure, distance, that geographic distance, impacts us psychologically. We think of things as being more abstract. But when we think about hybrid, we can eliminate that abstraction, because we can at least meet each other quite regularly and get to know each other as detailed people and not as abstract entities far away. So I think there's all these different dynamics that I think we're still learning about. And that's what I love about research is academia. They are looking at this stuff for us, and there's a lot being investigated. As that continues to come to the fore, if you keep bringing that to us through the podcast, I think that's fantastic.
The podcast that Theresa was referring to, where we cover the psychology of the workplace, is My Pocket Psych, and that is hosted by Dr. Richard MacKinnon, who you will hear from next. He's also appeared on this show as an individual guest and as part of the Connection and Disconnection series. So I've had many, many conversations about why we behave at work the way we do and all the meaty things associated with psychology at work. He'll be followed by Mark Kilby, who's also been on this show a lot, and I got to meet him in person when he came to London just before the lockdowns, well, actually just before the pandemic. He came to London for an Agile conference, and I was able to show him my favorite part of London, South Kensington, because that's where I was for the first 3 years. When I was studying, I was a student, and so I showed him around and then we had dinner. And I learned so much from him, from Mark, both through the conversations behind the microphone and the many others we've had privately. Then we'll hear from Pinar Akkaya, and it was the first time she's guested on this show, although I did interview her for another podcast I co-host called Facilitation Stories. And there she talked about how to build a team of internal facilitators in an organization. And Pinar, of course, is part of the team delivering our current program on leading online meetings together with Simon. So for now, let's hear from Richard, Mark, and then Pinar.
I'm going to channel what a lot of people have asked me questions about. A lot of my clients have been asking, and it's the sort of how-to. How do I do this? How do I do that? How do I manage relationships when I don't see these people for months at a time? How can I have difficult conversations over video? How can I influence people when we're not in the same room? For those people for whom this is new, there's an awful lot of questions. And if we can bring some evidence to the table and say, this is what works, or this is what works in these environments, they won't necessarily be at the mercy of a random Google search and end up taking advice from someone who's a enthusiastic amateur, let's say.
I would like to see a mix of the why and the how. You push the boundaries a lot in this podcast, but it would be great to go out even further to see, all right, what other different ways of working are there, and why do people do it that way? And how do they do it? Because that might inspire others to, again, start looking at, oh, they're doing this for this reason. This is how it's giving value to them and giving value to others. And maybe this gives me some ideas on how to shift or completely change my work.
I think, already it's a wonderful podcast. I'm not saying it just to flatter you, but this is what I think. And being also a creator of a totally different podcast, I really appreciate. Because I recognize the effort behind that many episodes, right? So first of all, let me just congratulate you for that. I think it is an excellent job. And then I was thinking about it, what else could it be? And I came up with actually one word, which is inspiration. Because I think inspiration plays a very big role for all of us, right? So we are inspired by people, by events, by places, by ideas, everything. So I think using inspiration as a departure point, I would be very happy to listen to more people's stories, but on an individual level, sometimes also corporate level, but on a priority, I think that will be an individual level. So what might inspire us? Can we go after those inspirations? What happened? What did they do? Also, maybe very next to it, maybe it's sister concept, the what if scenarios. So what if this happened in a different way? What if, it was totally the opposite of what happened already? So I would I don't know if I'm being too vague in here, but I would give you 2 keywords, which is inspiration and what if scenarios.
Great. It makes me think of segments as well. And now for this month's What If. So loads of inspiration there for myself, actually. Let's move on to the guests who had more specific suggestions. Simon Wilson will kick this bit off, and I'm enjoying working with Simon on what we think is going to be an audio-first course on asynchronous communication. I won't say much more about it right now because we are in the early stages of creating it, so we're still making decisions, and I don't know. I don't want to talk about something that then we change. Then we'll hear from our podcast polisher, Ross Winter, who looks after the audio in this podcast for the main part. Not for this one, not this episode. And sometimes his work is straightforward, but sometimes we do provide him with files which have different types of audio. And also, since I've bought a more sensitive microphone, my mouth clicks a lot, and he's taking care of that. And then we'll hear from Eva Rimbau Gilabert, who was one of the first people I met on Twitter to talk about remote work. And she's so on top of things and is so good at providing us with reliable information, at being evidence-based, that I hope she can continue popping into the show. So, Simon, Ross and Eva, and then we'll wrap up these suggestions with a broader thought from Bree.
So I think there is still a huge question about asynchronous working and how we make the best of that. And I'd like to see that covered in a podcast, and I'd also like to come and talk to another podcast about that. But I'd really like to hear more from organizations and teams about practically what are they doing there. So I think that's one thing. I'd also like to hear more about organizational culture and the evolution of organizational culture. I know this doesn't apply to you, Pilar, but I think there has been quite a lot of reflection on embedding technologies, organizations bringing in teams and so on. I think there's been quite a lot of reflection on how businesses, how companies, how organizations are organizing themselves. So thinking about remote team working, thinking about where people are based, how they connect up. I think the issue around culture is so significant. So how do people build and sustain relationships in remote teams? How do you get a sense of the culture of those organizations? So in that old distinction between, the focus on task and the focus on relationship, it's that relationship side that I think is the most important to explore and get into greater depth and detail about.
Bearing in mind, I feel like we're entering a new meta world of work and online sharing and decentralized systems and all this kind of stuff. So I would like to hear questions. Why are we spending time online looking for connection? And what kind of connection are we expecting? And how that works for everyone. And this leads into, can we cover more diverse needs in online spaces? For example, I've found personally, I struggled with Twitter because I just didn't, it took me a long time to kind of get it. I don't really use it anyway. It's not a platform for me. I think we've seen, a lot more diversity in creating platforms that work for certain ways of how people think. I'm really into Instagram because I'm a very visual person and I'm an audio person. I see things and I hear things, and that's how communication works for me. I think I'd like to question, how can we create a sort of more inclusive way of communicating to embrace everyone, I think, in their sort of preferred ways of interacting.
Yes. Well, as I said before, I think that hybrid is the new word. And we have to explain that remote is not a one black or white option. There are many grays in between full-time face-to-face and full-time remote. And it's these mixes of gray which are difficult or more difficult for organizations. So I would encourage you to help organizations to understand how hybrid can be done well.
I really love how the basis of the podcast is speaking with people and sharing, I guess, knowledge from different aspects. I love that you speak to psychologists and remote work experts and managers, and sort of getting at it from all of those angles, which I hope does continue, because I really enjoy that aspect of listening and hearing sort of multiple perspectives. I don't know. I think with the changes that I'm expecting to come over the next sort of few years, which I think we will be moving out of this basic, how do we make remote work into what is the future of work, what can work look like, into, I guess, more unique remote policies and strategies, into development of these ideas. I'd love to kind of see that those conversations follow that, and hearing from people that are very creative and thinking about this, and not the same, try to have a morning routine, or I don't know, not that that's been from the podcast by any means, but not simply how to use Slack asynchronously, or did you know that Slack, you can send messages the next morning or something, schedule your Slack messages, those sorts of things. I think it would be great to leave behind in the last few years and really move back to these more, I guess, intricate questions that I think will be cropping up very soon about the longevity of this sort of working style, and how it's going to morph to include a bit more globalization, a little bit more different industries, and moving away from, tech-based and all those sorts of things.
Thank you for all of that, guests, because it's given me a lot to spring off from, if springing off is a thing. But before we wrap up with the guests' final contributions, I wanted to thank also Anish Hindocha, who recorded some thoughts for the other two parts of this episode, but was not able to contribute to this part. Anish has been on the show. I've also interviewed him a couple of times for Facilitation Stories. Plus, he's been the only guest on our other podcast, Management Cafe, which I have to confess I've been neglecting for a while. But with Management Cafe, I'm about to give it a new leash of life. But I, again, don't want to jinx anything while we prepare for that. So Anish, you've guested for 3 shows with me. If you become a podcaster, do come over to Adventures in Podcasting. And when you go back to learning and continuing to learn your Spanish, you can come over and guest at Gastronostalgia. So yeah, there you go. And listeners, as you can see, when you start podcasting, you just can't stop. Okay, let's move on to the last question in this celebration of 300 episodes. And in the style of seasoned podcasters, I asked guests if there was anything else they wanted to say to you, our listeners, and past guests. So we'll start with Maya. And before we bring in Maya Middlemiss, a big thank you, Maya, because it's so much fun to press record and rant about, analyze and add commentary to all the things that are happening around us. And also it gives me a chance to broaden my knowledge of what's going on when I'm recording with you, with Maya, because listeners, I can't keep up. So let's start with Maya, and then I'll let the rest of the guests follow on.
The richness of the conversations that we're having, the nuances that we're getting to is so interesting. I think it's great that this show has the reputation to attract such interesting and varied guests with such fascinating takes on the way the world of work is changing. I mean, that original strapline still stands up because it includes everything. So yes, long may it continue.
I think there is something about the energy behind this conversation that points to a real opportunity for the future. We have seen this extraordinary change over the last couple of years. And although that's been hard in many ways, it has brought the focus and the energy into this discussion about the future of 21st century work life. So I think there's something about an opportunity to maintain that energy, even without the external stimulus of a pandemic, or at least without the acute phase of a pandemic. So for me, it's about keeping the energy, keeping that discussion alive, keeping the interest going.
Well, no, just I would like to say to you, Pilar, congratulations for your 300 programs, and that's a big, big, big win for you. It's an accomplishment, and just I would just say, just keep the good work coming.
Every guest that you're inviting is actually helping us to think other things and then think in a different way, or asking ourselves different questions that we haven't asked before. I think the past guests, the former episodes and everything, were all about inspiration, something that I was thinking, and then I hear something which is totally at the opposite direction. It helps us, I think, to find our blind spots, develop new perspectives, and getting inspired. So I would probably give this as a final message.
Congratulations on the milestone. Again, as someone who has a podcast, that's a fantastic thing to achieve. And for the continued quality and great output, it's fantastic. Love it.
I've really enjoyed being a part of the community that you've created, and learning a lot through the range of people that you talk to, and the conversations that you have with them. It whenever I listen to your podcast, as I often do around the house, washing the dishes or cooking or whatever, I'm often in the kitchen when I'm listening to the podcast. I always get a smile when I hear it come on, and you really seem to take great enjoyment from the work that you do and from the conversations that you have with people, and that's a joy to be able to listen to.
Anything else you'd like to say to listeners and past guests? I'd like to... me and my cat, Kuro, would like to say thank you, listeners, for listening to all the podcasts that I've worked on and all the guests that we've been hearing. I think it's great that we've got these work thought thinkers out there getting us all to question how we do things and create a better and more enjoyable future.
Well, thanks for having me. This has been so lovely to be back on the podcast, and I know I'll be amongst some very special people who I know you mentioned a couple that were guests for me as well, so I'm excited to be amongst them.
I'm looking forward to episode 400, 500, and 600. To be honest, because I've always enjoyed the podcast. I appreciate the broad perspective you take on the podcast, and I look forward to more of that.
Well, thank you very much. I'll definitely make it to episode 400. I can't promise 5 or 6.
I'm going to poke you for 500. Yeah.
I will. Hello and welcome to episode 1000. Oh, Mark, it's such a pleasure to talk to you. I think you are the guest that has appeared on more episodes than anyone else. I haven't counted them. So thank you very, 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 very much for all your contributions at different stages of our friendship. And I hope that you will contribute to many more of the next 100 at least, because I'm not committing to you.
Sounds like a deal. So.
Congratulations, Pilar. Good luck, everyone, as we figure out hybrid and as we continue to explore virtual work. I'm excited about it. I think there's great opportunities, and I'm looking forward to learning together and making changes for a better humanity within our work world.
Well, I can't top Theresa's words. So before we move on to the outtakes, all that remains is for me to thank the guests for episode 300. Remember, listeners, that you can catch their full interviews over at the other show called Work-Life Changes and Remote Work in Organizations. Sorry for the long title, but I'll stick the link in the show notes. Which reminds me, thanks, Maya, for all the show notes you've created for us over many episodes. Big thank you. And Ross Winter, thank you so much also for all your hands-on expertise. And also to Kate Rance for helping us with the visuals and being so flexible. And thank you to all the guests that have appeared on all 300 episodes. And of course, you, our listeners. Because when this show started back in 2014, there were not many podcasts talking about remote work, online collaborations, but now there are. So if you're still with us since pretty much the beginning, I can't thank you enough. And if you've joined us recently, well, I hope you will enjoy the backlist on our future episodes. So don't forget to subscribe to the show on whatever podcast app you use, or check out virtualnotdistant.com. I'll leave you now with the outtakes. Thank you for listening.
Estupendo.
Excellent. Muy bien.
Bien. Pues oye, nada, que te quede bonito.
And also just like to drop a plug, if you want any podcast editing done, then come and find me at podcastpolishing.com.
Shall I turn off my video as well?
I've turned it off for you.
Okay. Start again.
I did the micromanagement thing that technology is so good for.
Where the tagline, oh, hello. We have a guest featuring on this podcast today. The name is Kuro the cat. He likes to get involved sometimes. All right, mister. So we don't need to, this doesn't need to go on the podcast anyway.
Great. Good stuff. I will stop recording.